Our life in 2016, after some years of infertility, we were expecting our second child, a little girl called Layla. And at 39 weeks in the womb, she died. I was on the 13th of March. We were expecting her on the 20th of March. And on the 13th, I went out to preach on hell at the evening service. And little did we know she prepared for heaven. And that night she slipped away. And so the next morning we went to the hospital, and Jackie knew something wasn't quite right. So we went and we got confirmation on the scan that I still remember the words there. I'm sorry, there is no heartbeat. We could see her little face on the scan and everything. So our whole world fell apart in many ways. The bottom of our world gave way, and we entered into a situation which we had always heard of some parents having, but never being close to it ourselves. And here we were right in the midst of it. 3 days later, Jackie gave birth to this beautiful little girl, Layla, stillborn on the 17th of March, 10:25 a.m. And Ben came to the hospital to meet Layla. We wanted him to be as involved as possible. And he met her, held her. And, she weighed 7 pounds. She had full head of dark black hair. Beautiful little girl, looked just like Ben when he was born, but with all the feminine touches. And on the way home in the car, Jackie was staying at the hospital with Layla. I was going back that night, but I needed to take Ben home. A friend was looking after him that night. And in the car, I was just sort of driving in silence. And from the back seat, Ben says, "Daddy, will Mummy ever grow a baby that wakes up?" He was 3.5 years old. And I said, I don't know, Ben. Let's pray that maybe she does in time. And he said, "Why isn't Layla coming home with us?" And I said, because Jesus called her name and she's gone to be with him. He said, "When Layla's been in heaven a few days, will she come back to us?" And I said, "No, when you're with Jesus, you don't want to go anywhere else." I said, "We're going to have to go to her one day, Ben. She's not going to come to us." He said, "Does she not like us?" I said, "No, she does like us, Ben. It's just that she likes Jesus more. And so she's going to be with him until we go." And then he said, "Daddy, why did she die?" And I said, "Ben, I don't really know why. And even to this day, it's a mystery, actually, why she died." But in the 6 months prior to that, I had taught Ben a little catechism. He loved looking at the moon when we lived in Cambridge. So each night we'd find the moon in the night sky from the bedroom window. And I'd say, "Ben, what shape is the moon tonight?" And he'd say, "It's a crescent moon or a half moon or a gibbous moon." And then I'd say, "What shape is the moon always?" And he would say, "The moon is always round." And then I would say, "And what does that mean, Ben?" And he would say, "God is always good." And in God's providence, I taught him this, unbeknown to me or him, how relevant it would be. And so that night in the car, he said, "Why did she die?" And I said, "Ben, I don't know why she died." But I said, "You remember we've talked about the moon?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What shape is the moon always, Ben?" He said, "The moon is always round." I said, "That's right, Ben." I said, "Tonight it's hard to see the whole of the moon or any of the moon. But I said, we've got to remember, Ben, that God is always good. And for some reason, he thought it's better for Layla to go to heaven straight away." So I went home, put him to bed, and then I went back to the hospital. And as I went out of the door, I thought, let me actually look up and see what shape the moon is tonight. And there it was, lovely, clear, dark sky. And it was a half moon, and exactly a half moon. I thought, that really sums up today, because it was actually a really peaceful, joyful day for Jackie and I, and Ben meeting Layla, holding her, spending time with her. But it was also really sad as well. There was the darkness as well. And I thought this really sums it up. And I was so struck by how profound a conversation I'd had with Ben that I wrote it down on my phone, in a little notepad thing. I thought, I don't want to forget those kind of questions he asked me. And then that was in March 2016, and then we moved to the States in early December 2016, 9 months later. And within a few months, I just felt an urge to actually write a story about that. And I was procrastinating one night when I needed to prepare an Old Testament lecture, but it just sort of came to me. I felt inspired in the small I sense of the word. And so I just started writing a story about it, a conversation between Ben and me. And I had this refrain, the moon is round. But it was a friend of mine. So I wrote it, refined it, sat on it for a bit, gave it to a few people. And I gave it to a friend at Westminster, a student. And he said, this is really good. It's really moving. But he said, how about you flip it and have it not said from a narrator's perspective, but from Ben's perspective? And he said, and why not put a refrain in, the moon is always round, on every page? And so he really helped me sort of shape it. And so I'm really grateful to him, because he was really the genius behind the shaping of the story, whereas I had the general content there. So that's how it came about. Yeah. And then I showed Jackie my first draft. She said, no one's going to ever read this book. It's too sad. And then I showed her the updated one. She says, I really like this. Like, this is really nice now from Ben's perspective. And then, I finished it up, got it finalized, and I showed it to Jackie again, and she read it, and she says, look, no one's ever going to read this book. She said, it's just too sad. It's like, this is not a kid's book. You don't write a kid's book about a little girl who dies, And yeah, so we did. New Growth Press, Barbara Giuliani said, I really like it. I'd like to try this. I said, look, it's not going to be a big seller. Who wants to read this story to their kid, But for us, it was more just to, get Layla's testimony out there. And, 14,000 copies of that book's been sold.
Yeah. Well, we've sold heaps of them. And
you've sold 13,000 of them.
not that many, but.
And, we've had emails. We get emails a couple of times a year from people who've read that book, who've lost children at the same stage as we did. And even early miscarriages, and even people who have lost a spouse or a parent or some. They say this book has meant so much to them. And, at Layla's funeral, we had a full funeral for her. And at her funeral, Ian Hamilton, the minister, as he was preaching on Let the Little Children Come to Me, he was talking about Layla's testimony. He said, Layla had a great testimony. He said, she pointed us all to another world. She pointed us all to God. And then he just had this throwaway line. Sorry, you might want to edit this bit. You might want to edit that gap. He had this throwaway line where he just said, Layla the evangelist. And, there was about 170 people came to that funeral, and of a little girl they'd never met. And to this day, people who talk to us about that funeral say we've never forgotten Layla the evangelist. And it was a really inspired moment from Ian as he was preaching. And that's what we view her as, Layla the evangelist. And here she is. The other way I put it to people is she being dead yet speaks. And this book is her testimony, And so we're really delighted that she is speaking into the lives of others, even though she's dead. She, being dead yet speaks, and she's communicating the goodness of God in the midst of some very tough situations that people face. The nicest feedback we had was from an orphanage in South Africa. A guy sent us a photo of these orphans who have been raised in an orphanage. Some of them were dumped on the side of a road in shoeboxes as babies. And they've grown up in this orphanage, and apparently it's their favorite book. And we got a photo sent to us of these little African orphans crowded around reading The Moon is Always Round. And then at night, they were all linked arms outside looking at a full moon. Yeah. So it's a very, very special book for us. And yeah.
Well, thank you so much for opening up about that, those experiences, and thank you for putting them down into that beautiful book. It's helped so many.